In this second video for transformations of functions, we're going to specifically look at this third bullet where we talk about being able to determine changes in domain or range due to a transformation. When we do this, we're going to have a problem like this, and we're going to ask to sketch a graph that has a domain that goes from 0 to 4 and a range that goes from -1 to 1. And I can really draw anything that fits in to this rectangle here, and I could show you that rectangle. It can be any graph that fits in this area. So let's draw one. Let's see, I'm going to have something that, let's say it starts about here and goes up and then back down. Okay, so there's the graph that I'm going to use for this. And we can see that it goes from 0 to 4 on the x, and it goes from -1, there's my low point, up to my high point of 1 on the y-axis. We're going to get rid of this yellow. And as we do this, we're going to be looking at each of these rules down here and seeing what happens to the domain and range. So let's take a look at this first one. This first one tells us that we're going to take our graph right 2 and up 1. And so I'm going to just draw over this. There we go. And if I take this graph, the red one here, and I go right 2 and up 1, we can see that my graph has a completely different domain and range. And in fact, since all I did was go right 2 on the domain, I can simply add 2 to both of these. And my new domain goes from 2 to 6 because 0 plus 2 is 2, 4 plus 2 is 6. Similarly, for the range, since it went up 1, I can add 1 to both of these values, and I can see that my range is going to go from 0 to 2 because -1 plus 1 gives me 0, and 1 plus 1 gives me 2. And I can see that on my graph here. My low value here is at 0, and my high value is now at 2. All right, so let's get rid of some of this and move on to our next one. I'll get my red graph back. So there it is. And this time I've got -f of x, and you'll recall that that is a flip over the x-axis. So when we flip over the x-axis, let's take a look at this and go like that. There's our graph, and we flipped it over the x-axis, and you can see that my domain is still 0 to 4, and that happens sometimes where our domain does not change at all. So our domain is still from 0 to 4, and you'll notice that my range, it still goes up to 1 and down to -1, so my range is also unchanged. That's not always the case with flips, just in this particular situation, because it goes up to 1 and down to -1. All right, so now let's look at our next one. This one is going to be a flip over the y-axis. Now when we flip over the y-axis, and let's take our graph here and take it back to what it was. So we'll move it back. We're going to now flip it left-right, but if it goes over the y-axis, it's actually going to end up over there. And we see that our red graph, its domain, is now actually going all the way over to -4 over here. So -4 to 0, but its range is unchanged. It still goes from -1 to 1. All right, so that's good. We're going to put this, let's just get rid of this little thing, and we're going to need this graph for the next page. So I'm going to grab all of that and copy it. And here we are on the next page. And let's see, edit, paste. Oops, that is not what I wanted. All right, I got it going now. And let's put that red graph back where it was. So there we go, it's back to where it was. And this time we're going to do something completely different. We're going to do 4 times f of x. Now this one is going to be a vertical stretch. And this is going to be a lot harder to show with my red graph because smartboards don't allow us to just stretch things up and down. So I'm going to take that away. And in a vertical stretch, I want us to realize that everything's going to get stretched 4 times as far away. So this was slightly below, but this one that's at 1 is going to go all the way up to 4. And this one at -1 is going to go all the way down to -4. And so kind of run out of room, but you can see that my high and low points are going to go from -4 to 4, but notice nothing happened to x. So our domain is still 0 to 4, but our range, and this is kind of like the first one, we multiply both by 4. And so we're going to go from -4 to 4. All right, so now let's get rid of this red here. Oops. And let's go on to the next one. And in this one, we have a horizontal stretch. And so the most important thing is to recognize that this is going to be a horizontal stretch times 3. Because we're multiplying by 1/3, so we're actually going to stretch it times 3 because this is a number between 0 and 1. And so when we do this, we're actually going to go over here to our domain, and we're going to multiply each of these times 3. So our domain is going to go from 0 to 12, or that horizontal stretch, if I draw my graph, is going to do something like that, all the way out here to 12. But you'll notice that our range remains unchanged. So our range is still from -1 to 1. A bad looking one. Let's fix those up. So this should be a square bracket and that should be a 1. All right, so our last one, and let's just erase some of the work here. Our last one is going to do 2 things to our graph. It is going to shrink vertically. So shrink vertically by 1/2. So that's going to affect our range. So we're going to multiply that times 1/2. And it's going to shrink horizontally. And that's going to be by 1/4. And so we're going to multiply both of these by 1/4. Or divide by 4 if you like that better. Actually, you might, let's think of that as division. So we can multiply by 1/4 or we can divide by 4. So we're going to divide each by 4. And so my new domain and range, domain is going to be 0 to 1 because I shrunk this by a factor of 4. And my range is going to be from -1/2 to 1/2. So if we wanted to see what this looks like, let me get that square bracket on here again. So this is going to shrink vertically and horizontally, and it's going to do something like that. So it's going to go from 0 to 1. I don't think I shrunk it quite enough, but if we think that that's 1, that would work. And then up to 1/2 and down to -1/2. All right, so this homework section, what we just did is going to help you out with 65 through 75 odd.